our website. Okay, just as the last couple of people are trickling in, I will kick us off here. Good afternoon. My name is Liliana Bechtold from the School of Cities, and I'm so excited to welcome everybody here to our session today on what public branch libraries mean to immigrant neighborhoods and what they can teach us about culture and identity. The School of Cities was founded in 2018 to be the University of Toronto's multidisciplinary center for urban research, education, and engagement. And we are dedicated to uncovering new ways for cities and their residents to thrive. And today's Knowledge Cafe is hopefully going to be a big part of that. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge first that for thousands of years, this is the land upon which we have traditionally been the territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, or what we settlers call North America. And the School of Cities and myself, we're so grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. I'm in Toronto. If you're not in Toronto, I know we're gathered here online from all over the place. I really encourage you to look into the history of the space that you're in, what you can do to help steward it. This land in Toronto is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Agreement, an agreement on how the land can be shared to the mutual benefit of all of its inhabitants. And I really hope that our conversation today can generate some insights and some thoughtful reflection about what that means and how we can really embody that. The Knowledge Cafe today is a monthly speaking opportunity for the tri-campus community at the University of Toronto to present analysis, highlights of some research going on at the school, some other cool people that are at U of T on a theme that is important and relevant to cities. The Knowledge Cafe provides a platform for faculty as well as students and researchers who are working to uncover solutions to creating more just, equitable, and sustainable cities. This year, our theme is belonging, migration, and thriving, and we've lined up 8 incredible speakers from departments across the community, all the way from art history to industrial engineering. This is just one of those presentations, so I really hope that you will be able to come out to some of our other ones in the new year. And for learning more about that information, keeping posted on these events and our other events, you can visit the School of Cities website, or you can see the chat for more information. Throughout the presentation today, if you have some questions, you can feel free to just drop them in the chat, and I will get to as many as I can at the end of the presentation. And with that, I will hand you over to Aditi. She was actually my professor in the past, so I can speak from experience and say that if you haven't heard her speak before, you're definitely in for a treat. So take it away.
Thank you so much, Liliana, for such a wonderful introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be part of the Knowledge Cafe. I'm really excited to present this project to you. So this is actually a research project I've been working on for over 10 years, and it's still a work in progress, so I look forward to the discussion afterwards. But I began this project in 2009 as a graduate student. And so if there's any graduate students or students in the audience, just take note that things you work on now, they can keep growing and growing and going. So I started working on this as a graduate student. And as a graduate student, I was working with a local nonprofit in Boston's Chinatown to create an affordable housing development plan in the neighborhood. And while doing research for that plan, many residents actually told me that they really wanted a branch library on the ground floor of this affordable housing building. And I thought that was really interesting, and I looked into it more, and I quickly learned that there was a long-standing movement in the neighborhood for a public library branch that had been missing since the 50s. So this presentation is really the story of that movement. And as you can see from the slide, I'll take you back to 1896 and bring you to present day. And I'll just start by saying in all neighborhoods, but especially immigrant communities, a public library provides residents with resources that can be used to enhance education levels, connect with fellow citizens, foster personal interests, and enjoy safe meeting spaces. And you'll see throughout the presentation that the public library is a diagnostic window into society, and the building, its operations, and the services it provides reflect the social, economic, and political context of time and place. So this research demonstrates that the story of Boston's Chinatown Branch Library is more than just a historical account of a building or a concept. It's actually the story about the development of a neighborhood, the preservation of culture and identity, as well as the growth of coalitions and divisions. So I'll start by sharing two broad research questions I had when I started the project. And the first is, what are the various roles libraries play in community development over time in immigrant neighborhoods? And the second is, when branch libraries are underfunded or missing from the community, how do residents mobilize to fill in that gap? And so I seek to answer these questions through the case of Boston's Chinatown Library, and we'll revisit them at the end. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you the story of the Boston Chinatown Library through 6 main time periods as listed on the slide. And you'll see that at first, the addition or removal of a library in Boston's Chinatown was largely an extension of city policy. And then eventually the presence of a library in the neighborhood became an extension of grassroots community movements. And through the lens of the Chinatown Library, we see the shift from the city wanting to develop the community of Chinatown to the community of Chinatown wanting to develop itself. And what's interesting about this story is that the transformation takes shape incrementally over time, and it also mirrors the changing attitudes towards community development, particularly in the United States. So we'll start with this first time period, 1858 to 1938, where we can think of the public branch library as an assimilation processing center. So I want you to take a look at this map from 1902, and you'll see that the area highlighted in orange is what was part of Boston's Chinatown in 1902. And the Boston Dispensary is that little purple area of medical facility. And you'll see throughout the presentation how these two interests are expanding and competing with each other in Boston's Chinatown. So the motivation behind the founding of the Boston Public Library and its branches was actually tied to increased immigration into the city of Boston. So population was increasing so fast because of the arrival of foreign-born residents that were coming looking for new opportunities. And hundreds of thousands of new immigrants arrived in Boston during the decades after the Civil War. This includes Irish, Italian, German, Greeks, Chinese, Eastern Europeans, and Russians. And basically, the Boston elite wanted a way to Americanize and educate these people. And their solution was actually a public library. And so the wealthy and established classes were compelled by their moral beliefs to promote the perceived needs of the general public, which was this increasingly diverse, and they used the word back then, alien population. I guess we still even use it today, which the wealthy feared and disliked. And that's what led to the founding of the Boston Public Library in 1852. And we see this in other cities such as Baltimore that founded their library in 1882, Philadelphia was founded in 1891, and then the New York Public Library in 1895. And this is actually a quote from an early trustees report of the library in 1852. And it reads, it is of paramount importance that the means of general information should be so diffused that the largest possible number of persons should be induced to read and understand questions going down to the foundations of our social order, which are constantly presenting themselves and which we as a people are constantly required to decide, and do decide either ignorantly or wisely. So there was this concern and anxiety from the Boston elite about the lives and morals of urban immigrants. And the belief was a library, a public library branch, could be an uplifting institution to help. And actually, during World War I in the early 1900s, many military personnel responsible for training foreign-born citizens for participation in the armed forces realized that many of these immigrant residents couldn't understand English or follow orders. So this actually led the American Library Association to establish the Committee of Work with Foreign-Born to Americanize everyone. And then in 1917, as some of you may know, philanthropist Andrew Carnegie invested $41 million for the creation of 1,679 buildings throughout the US to be libraries. And Carnegie was obsessed with data and wanted to track and see how libraries were helping low-income immigrants. But the data actually showed that few users were actually immigrants or low-income. So this here is an image of the first rendition of the Boston Public Library in Chinatown. It was called the Tyler Street Delivery Station. And in 1890, there were only 250 Chinese residents in Boston's Chinatown, and they were mostly men. And this library was located at the corner of Harrison and Broadway on Tyler Street. And this address is important. I'll come back to it later. And basically the motive behind a delivery station was to help educate and Americanize foreigners, as I talked about before, and provide convenient access to reading materials. And the main branch of the Boston Public Library, as in many cities, was located in one of the richer parts of the city, and it was inaccessible to the masses and newcomers. And so it was this sentiment to Americanize that these delivery stations proliferated throughout Boston. And so here are some images from inside the delivery station on Tyler Street. So Fanny Goldstein, she was a Tyler Street branch librarian, and in an annual report about the library from 1922, she shared how she recruited patrons for the library from the Quincy Evening School that taught English. And she saw it as her mission to help these immigrants, which included Syrians, Greeks, Italians, French, and the Chinese, to assimilate into society. And the Tyler Street branch provided valuable services such as citizenship coaching, reading material in several languages, and recreational community events. And she expressed that the staff was proud of the diversity of its patrons and having the library serve as the most democratic meeting place in the district. And here are some other images of inside the delivery street station. This is from between 1916 and 1930. And this last image I want to share with you, this is a bookmobile, and aside from these delivery stations, the Boston Public Library also operated bookmobiles, which would travel to areas in the city with immigrants. And this bookmobile, if you can see in the image at the top, there's a sign that says, "Why read good books? Learn more." And it's accompanied by a series of flags representing all the immigrants that lived in the neighborhood. Okay, so that brings us to the second part of the story from 1939 to 1950, where we see the addition or removal of the library as an extension of city policy. And so here's our map from 1938, and you can see that Chinatown is expanding in orange, and now we have the New England Medical Center in purple, which is also taking up land in Chinatown at this time. And so, unfortunately, what happens in this time period is that the Public Branch Library Administration shut down the Tyler Street branch in 1938 for budgeting reasons, and because of the Great Depression, there was a lot of debt in the city. And it's interesting because a lot of research shows that during recessions and depressions, libraries get the most use, particularly libraries such as this one that are operating in immigrant communities, but they're also the first thing to get shut down during those times as well. And when this shutdown was announced by the city, actually all of the various different groups in the neighborhood organized a protest, which you can see from the flyer, to say we don't want our library to be shut down. It really serves as a meaningful and important space here. And in fact, 200 children from the area carried signs that read "No library, no school, closed library, closed mines." But it didn't work. The library was shut down, and the way that the city sort of confirmed that this was the right decision was that they were looking at data, at population data. And they said, well, the population in this area is decreasing, but they weren't taking note that actually certain immigrant populations like Chinese immigrants was increasing. And then what happens is that because of ongoing protests, the city decided to just have like a municipal building that would serve as book coordination among schools in the area. And so people could request books and come and get them from this building, but it still didn't sort of serve the same purposes as a branch library. And then for a very, very short period of time, the library was reopened in 1951. And this was because World War II affected Chinese immigration to the country in Boston. And the War Brides Act enabled more Chinese women to come to Boston and brought about a 1,000% increase in Chinatown's female population during the late 1940s. And also by the end of World War II, the economy was booming. And so for the similar fears I talked about earlier around anxiety about immigrant morale, the library was reopened. But then just 5 years later, it was closed again in 1956 to make way for a major highway, which was very common at that time in American cities. So then this brings us to the next part of the story between 1960 and 1980. And this is the part of the story where the library is sadly just missing. But there's a lot of important things that happen in Chinatown's history that sort of led to it to come back later on. And so you'll see in the map that Chinatown is expanding, and so is the medical center. And so there's a lot of conflict over land and who belongs in this neighborhood. And so in 1960, when there was no library, the then Boston Mayor Ed Lowe created the Boston Redevelopment Authority and pledged this idea of planning with the people. And by 1965, the government had abolished the quota system, and the number of Chinese people entering increased fivefold in 2 years. And we see the shift, a change from autocratic politics to participatory planning that informs the next phase of the Chinatown library story. And a similar shift was taking place in library culture. So by the 60s and 70s, libraries became more accommodating to immigrants rather than forcing assimilation. And also branch libraries believed they had a social obligation to help the disadvantaged. And Chinatown could never experience this shift in practice firsthand because of the lack of library services in the neighborhood. And basically, there was a sizable portion of Chinatown residents that were actually forced to move during the 50s and 60s because of land takings, along with other social justice issues. And this library movement lost momentum, and the neighborhood was more focused on sort of defending their turf. And so because of what was happening then, in 1977, the Chinese Progressive Association was founded out of a series of community organizing campaigns around issues such as Chinese parents into the Boston school desegregation process, police brutality against Chinese Americans, and living wage for garment factory workers, and community control over land development in Chinatown. And also the bookmobile that you saw earlier, it officially stopped operating in 1980. And so then what happens next is that from 1990 to 2008, you see more momentum around the library movement, and we see how it becomes an extension of community movements. And here's our map. We see Chinatown expanding, as well as the New England Medical Center. And there's a lot of development in this part of Boston. If you're from the Boston area, you know that there's sort of constant conflict over land in the area. And so the early 1990s marked the beginning of a very important community planning process in Chinatown. And the Chinatown Master Plan project occurred every 10 years since 1990, where grassroots organizations and residents and city officials and other stakeholders come together to develop the vision for the neighborhood and strategize implementation steps to achieve these goals. And one of the main desires was a need for geographic and linguistically accessible space as the neighborhood was being crowded out by large medical institutions and other types of development. And so basically in 2001, a large-scale survey about the absence of a library in Chinatown was administered by youth that were part of the Chinese Progressive Association to 349 Chinatown residents and stakeholders. And these youth learned about the library movement because the Chinese Progressive Association had a lot of youth programming trying to keep young people connected to Chinatown and connected to their heritage. And they sort of learned about the delivery room and the movement for a library, and the youth picked up the movement and said, this is really important. We should really have our own library, and reignited it. And that's why they administered their survey. And 100% of the people who took the survey said that they wanted a library, and 62% already had a library card, and 34% lacked English proficiency. And 29% said that they had a lot of difficulty accessing nearby branches or the main branch. And so this is really what reignited and marked this community movement to bring the library back. And young people were taking charge of that, going to community meetings, flyering about it, writing letters to their city councilor. And this is a very important time for the movement. And then what happens in 2009 and 2010, you see how newcomers that were coming into the neighborhood because of new development actually also helped bolster this movement as well. So this is our map of Chinatown in 2014, getting larger, but we also see the conflict with the New England Medical Center and Tufts University. And there's a lot of commercial development, luxury condo development, which is not common for many different Chinatowns. And what happens at this time then is that some residents that moved into some of the luxury condo buildings, and they were not Chinese, they were white American residents that had a lot of resources. They learned about the library movement through the organizing of the youth, and they decided that they wanted to be part of it. And so their condo building had a vacant commercial space. They worked with the building and with students at Harvard University and with the organizers in Chinatown to create a demonstration project called the Storefront Library. This was happening when I was a master's student and first learned about the movement. And so students at Harvard designed the inside of the Storefront Library. A lot of people donated money. The Boston Public Library donated some books. And the idea was this was a demonstration project to show that the community really needed a library. And what they did is they collected tons and tons of data about who was coming, what services they were using, how they were using them, at what points in time it was most busy. And this data would then be used to show the city that we indeed need a library and look at how it's being used. The Storefront Library only lasted about 6 months, and in 2010, it was officially closed. So it was a temporary demonstration project that was created to really show we need this and we need this now. And then this brings us to the last part of the story, which is the last decade. And based off of the Storefront Temporary Library in 2012, another temporary library was built at the bottom of actually an affordable housing building. It was called the Chinese Educational Lantern. And I actually have some interviews.
My name is Alice Lam, and I currently work as the manager of the reading room, which is one of the projects to set up interim programming and library services for the Chinatown Lantern Cultural and Educational Center. And I first got involved with the center almost more than a decade ago when I was a youth intern. That's part of the Chinese Progressive Association summer program. So, back then we were doing this summer program where we learned about the Chinatown community, the history of the neighborhood. And throughout that summer, we had the opportunity to meet Stephanie Fan, who at that time was and still is very involved with the Chinese Historical Society of New England. And at that time, Stephanie had told us that, there actually used to be a Chinatown branch library in the community. And a lot of people used it, and due to different reasons, through urban planning, the library was demolished. And although there was still a huge need and interest from the community, it was just never rebuilt for us. And that was kind of the catalyst that inspired the youth in my program to do a survey to kind of get a sense of, is there really such a need? Does the community want something like that back? And we did a survey, talked to over 300 people, and everybody thought that it is important to have a library back in Chinatown, but it's been more than a 10-year struggle. And I think there's been a lot of milestones that we've achieved through the way. For example, having the feasibility study done back in 2008, having the storefront library project go up, and now more recently having the reading room open up to provide these services. So I think we've gone a long way, but there's definitely still a lot of work to be done. I think the cool thing about young people, the great thing is that we're very idealistic, very hopeful. And I think that's the kind of energy and mentality that you need to achieve something this big. So I'm glad that I felt that way and that back then, and I still feel the same way now. And I think now that I'm older, I have a better sense of what are the different tools and strategies we can utilize to make it happen. So yeah, I think it's important and good that we have young people kind of help push the community forward. What do we see the role of the cultural center library to be now and for the future? I definitely think that Chinatown is a very special place because it's a place where the Chinese immigrant, Asian American immigrant community first comes in and gets introduced to the US society. It's kind of like the place where people come in to get help, to get resources, and then hopefully to either assimilate or integrate into society and figure out what they can do given their new life. And I think given Chinatown's history and all the different struggles that the community has gone through, there's a lot of significance there. So I think the cultural center can really play a role in helping teach the next generation, teach other communities, and tell the story of Chinatown and the people who call it their community and their home. And I also think that, even though a lot of the immigrant families and they may move out of Chinatown after they've been able to get established and be in a better place, they still come back to Chinatown. This is still the hub for the community. So we really believe that the cultural center can play the role of pulling people back into Chinatown. And one of the thinking behind the name of Chinatown Lantern is that the cultural center would serve as a beacon, that it would be a place of light, attracting folks from outside of the community and to come and learn about us.
So that's a quote from Alice Lung, as you heard, who was one of the youth organizers and then worked at one of the temporary libraries, this Chinatown Lantern Cultural and Education Center. And I thought she made a lot of really salient points about the movement and about the role of the library. And then here's another image from inside the cultural center. I have another quote to play for you, but I think for the sake of time, I'll keep moving and then maybe I can play it later during the Q&A.
My name is Kyle Lee.
Here, there we go. And then what happens in 2018, so between 13 and 18, there was no library, no temporary space, but the organizing continued. And what happens is that the city finally says, okay, we are going to fund a permanent branch in the neighborhood. So this is really exciting and really historic and really came from all that work that was started by youth in the 1990s. So it took 28 years since then, but even before, if we go back to the 1950s when it was closed, the city announces, oh, we're bringing back the library. And after 2013, I actually stopped following the story as closely. And then in 2018, when it was announced the library was coming back, I became really interested in what finally actually made the library return. Why did the city finally agree? And sort of reignited the research that I am sharing with you today. And it would take a bit of time for the city to locate the land for the permanent branch and design the library and create programming that was appropriate. So what they've done is that they've created a temporary space on Boylston Street, if you know Boston, which is sort of one of the main arteries of Boston's Chinatown, in kind of like this strip mall like structure, and it's all served and funded by the Boston Public Library. And this image here is from opening celebration. And right now what's happening is many studies and community planning processes around actually designing the permanent space, which is going to be located on land that's owned by the Boston Planning and Development Authority. And it's currently a parking lot. And one of the local community development organizations, Asian Community Development Corporation, which is the same group that I was working with as a master's student when I learned about the movement, is going to be one of the co-developers and help design the ultimate library. And the vision, which I learned about all the way back in 2009, is that this community development corporation is going to build affordable housing, and then the ground floor is going to be a public branch library. So I'm now in the process of tracking that, and I've worked with a wonderful research team and my research assistants this summer to sort of catch us up on the last 5 years about what's going on and how did this all come to be. And just revisiting the research questions, what are the various roles libraries play in community development over time in immigrant neighborhoods? And when branch libraries are underfunded or missing from the community, how do residents mobilize to fill in the gap? So a couple of kind of conclusions about these questions. So through my research through all those different time periods, I found that the Chinatown Library had many different meanings at different times. So in the beginning, we talked about how it was an assimilation processing center to Americanize, assimilate new immigrants. And of course, a really important gathering space for immigrant communities. It serves as an economic training ground where people can go and learn new skills and learn about opportunities in their neighborhood or in their city. But then also, as Chinatown started having land struggles and competing with larger institutions and developers and commercial development, the library took on really important new meanings. It became a symbol of ethnic identity assertion. It was almost as if the community could get their own Chinatown library, then it was a symbolic acknowledgement from the city that you indeed exist, and this is an important ethnic community in the neighborhood. It served as a way of turf defense, of Chinatown sort of saving its land and not allowing these developers and institutional players to encroach upon it. And it was a form of political clout building as well. And Chinatown's various organizations and nonprofits have so many archives and archival documents, and there's no central place to share that history or keep that history safe. They're scattered throughout the various offices of these different organizations. And a library would be the perfect place to save that heritage as well. And as Alice Leung discussed in her interview, that, and this happens again, we see this in Toronto, that Chinatown in the inner city is sort of a satellite destination, but we see other ethnic enclaves being created in suburban communities because people are getting priced out. But a library would allow then these scattered Chinatown communities to come back into the center where Chinatown was originally located and sort of celebrate their history in the library. And then the last point I'll just make is that this summer I had a research team that found all of the various news articles between 2012 and 2022 over the last 10 years about the library. There are 21 different articles that reported about it. And these research assistants did a wonderful job tagging or coding what these articles were about as we're trying to uncover the rest of the story. So the articles spoke about this idea of a transient library to a permanent space and what that meant for the community, the importance of multi-purpose programming in a library, how the residents and particularly the youth mobilized to fill the gaps, and that people really had an emotional, affective attachment to the idea of a library, and that if it returned to the community, it's like I said, a acknowledgement that you're important and you're part of the city's history. And then also this tension between revitalization and gentrification. So the idea that a revitalization plan for the neighborhood would include bringing a library back, but revitalization, as we know, leads to gentrification. And then that means that Chinatown's disappearing, and who would the library actually be serving? And I'll end with these two important and paradoxical conclusions that we found. There's two paradoxical mechanisms that led to the permanence of this hyperlocal institution. And the first is the organizing of Chinatown youth who wanted to stay connected to their heritage in their rapidly changing neighborhood that led to the permanence. But then at the same time, it was the resources of new Chinatown residents who were unintentionally gentrifying the neighborhood that actually gave the movement a lot of momentum and power. So they're sort of at odds with one another, but both led to the city to finally say in 2018, you can have a library. So I will end there so we can have discussion, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's such an amazing story. And it's so cool to see that you've been following it for such a long period of time. To be able to really see its development is such an amazing thing. I'm going to start with actually just a question that I have, which aligns with a lot of the questions that were submitted to us, which is, what do you think the implications of the kind of story of this organizing and this movement and this history could be for Toronto, where we have our own Chinatown that is facing all kinds of gentrification pressures, and we have our own issues with also the Toronto Public Library? What do you think sort of kind of learnings might there be for Toronto and for us here?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Such an important question. And actually this summer, I had my research team look into a bit of the history of the Toronto Public Library. And it's interesting because Boston is the oldest public library system, but Toronto is the largest. And Toronto's public library system, I mean, you said that there's some problems, but it's actually very sophisticated. Their branch library system is very, very sophisticated. And I think that Boston and some other American cities can learn some lessons. And there's no, from our research so far, there isn't necessarily a Chinatown branch library. But what we did learn is that the branch library system in Toronto does have a youth council, and youth are very important in helping sort of guide the programming of branch libraries, and we're looking into what they do and how those youth councils were formed. But I found that really interesting because of the role that youth played in Boston's Chinatown in bringing the library back. As for gentrification in Toronto's Chinatown, like I said, I think the idea of a library is not just a place where we go to get books or resources or even for programming. But if we think about a public library branch in historic immigrant communities as a place of memorialization, as a place of history, I feel like what it does then is it gives these neighborhoods and the acknowledgement and symbolism that they are very important in the city's history while rapid change is still occurring.
Yeah, that sort of brings me to my next question, which we had submitted. I thought something that was so interesting is like the role of youth and how intergenerational this space was, how that ended up working. And we had a question about how the seniors in the community responded to changes that were led by younger generations and sort of newcomers to the area, how their needs were met, how sort of like the intergenerational collaboration on this area sort of developed and what that looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Chinese Progressive Association, it was an organization, as I said, that was founded in the 70s. And so by the 90s, when they had this youth program, a lot of the leaders of the organization were elders. And it was the elders feeling like we really need to educate the next generation about our history, about our work, about our neighborhood. And youth really took to that, and they really wanted to be connected to that history and engaged in the different causes and histories that the elders were teaching them, like this library movement. So there's a lot of cross intergenerational programming and collaboration happening in the neighborhood. I think in the quote that I played for you from Alice Lung, she talks about a woman from the Chinese Historic Society that helped her understand the library movement. Stephanie Fan is her name. And so Stephanie Fan, a really important, well-known elder in the neighborhood, she really takes it upon herself to educate young people, connect young people to these different histories and resources. And then also, I mean, I had to go very fast because we didn't have so much time. There's so much like richness in this project, but with the storefront library, that demonstration project, they collected a lot of data about who was attending. And so there was a lot of non-English speaking elders that would go and spend their time in that space. And there was a lot of people who were in school, in high school and middle school, that would go and spend their time in that space. And they were often there together at the same time. So then you just sort of see how the public library branch is operating as a third space. And there's all this cross intergenerational interaction just because it's a place that's meeting the needs of both populations.
Yeah, I think the concept of the library as a third space is so interesting. And you also mentioned other possibilities that I haven't even thought about, like combining housing with libraries. What do you think sort of maybe the future of this kind of project looks like? How can we incorporate this stuff in our cities, or what are some creative solutions that we could have to have more of these third spaces, more of these library spaces?
Yeah, that's also a really great question. I think that we often think about the ground floor of affordable housing developments being commercial spaces, and we should think about them as being more of these civic spaces like branch libraries. And what I think is really interesting is that in 2009, as a graduate student in planning, when I was working on creating this affordable housing development plan with the same nonprofit that's now in charge of the development that the library will be in, I remember that there was a lot of pushback from practitioners in the city that said, well, that's never going to happen. Like, how is that ever going to be funded? Like, it's just not possible for a branch library to be at the ground floor of an affordable housing development. The numbers won't make sense. And here we are nearly a decade later, and that is actually the plan. And that's exactly what's going to happen. So I think the main takeaway here is that we have to keep imagining and reimagining what's possible in our cities. And I think especially in the field of planning, there's this balance of being really practical and thinking outside of the box. But what, thinking outside of the box, it can happen. It might take some time, but it definitely can happen. So I guess I would just say, like, we have to keep thinking of solutions to different types of problems and not get scared if it doesn't feel like that solution can be met right away.
Yeah, we have another question in the chat just from Angel, who says, how do you think the Chinatown community, just to go back to the point about sort of like intergenerational connections and learning, how do you think the community kept up interest in the library throughout multiple generations when that space wasn't even there? How do you think that they sort of, brought this from generation to generation as a project that people were so passionate about?
Yeah, thank you, Angel, for your question. I'm going to give Angel a call out. I'm really happy she's here. Angel is one of the research assistants on the project this summer who read all of the media in the last decade about the library and coded articles and did an amazing job. So thanks, Angel, for the question. I can pose it back to you as well. But I would say that a lot of the groups in Chinatown, like Chinese Progressive Association and many other nonprofits that were founded in the 70s, they're very active and committed to their neighborhood. And I think the fact that the elders took it upon themselves to continuously create programs for younger generations is sort of how the movement got sustained over time. The fact that we just had really active civic leaders in the 70s that kept going, that they didn't think like, oh, this is no longer our time anymore. They took it upon themselves to educate youth.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I was also just wondering how, because also when I was listening to the presentation and the ideas at the beginning of the presentation, I was thinking, wow, this does seem really like a big thing to imagine. And I can't even imagine embarking on like a organizing project like this. What do you think were some of the key things that people did together to really bring this to the city, to convince the city this is something that's important, this is something that's worthwhile? Because I know there's so many projects like this that I think could really benefit from an understanding of what exactly happened here that made it so successful.
I think the various demonstration projects were really great because at the city level too, officials really respond to data. And so the demonstration projects allowed short periods of time to collect that data. That initial survey that I talked to you about, if you look in city documents, that 300-person survey is cited and quoted a lot. So creating kind of on the ground, even if they're small scale or temporary moments to collect information to show that there is in fact a need, I think is really important. And then also bringing up the issue over and over again at public meetings and not letting it go, and writing op-eds or having a lot of like public events around it. So every time one of these temporary spaces opened or closed for the library, there was a celebration. And then the media would report on the celebration. And that means the story would get told again that this neighborhood is missing a library, and it came and it went. And so just sort of keeping that momentum and using opportunities to get limelight on the issue and collect data about the issue, I think really helped this particular movement and story.
Wow, yeah, that's amazing. Maybe just before we wrap up, one final question or some final thoughts from you. What are your sort of hopes for the future of this kind of project? Where do you think it might go in the next 5 or the next 10 years? What, in your like a sort of ideal future, what do you think this would look like or how it could expand?
Oh, that's a really great question. Well, from a research perspective, I want to better understand what happened in the last decade, and also particularly during the pandemic, if the movement sort of got quiet and then they picked up again, or if they were also organizing virtually and what was happening, and sort of share lessons from that, going back to your your last question about how different neighborhoods and communities can learn from this story to organize around different initiatives, not just a public library, but other sort of hyper local things that cities should be funding and supporting. And then in terms of the institution, I'm really excited to see there's going to be a lot of community planning processes around this new branch. And because there's such a long history behind the movement, I'm really excited and interested to see how they reinvent what this branch looks like in the neighborhood. And will it have different functions and services and programs than the other branches that are very particular to Chinatown and the history? And also, after learning from that, I want to compare like how our Canadian library branch systems doing, and are there any stories like this? I know Vancouver has a really robust public library system as well, serving their immigrant populations really beautifully. From what I've read about the Toronto Public Library system, it's also really great. So doing some more comparative work around that too.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'm so excited. I feel like I'll definitely be looking out for this in the future because this is such a fantastic topic. And it's been so great to have this conversation today. Nadia has some awesome points about libraries as third spaces in the chat. It's been so great to see that kind of like sharing across disciplines of this kind of information, which I think is so important. And thank you so much for bringing your work here. It's so cool to see. I love this kind of stuff. And I know that everybody else really appreciates getting the opportunity to see it. So thank you so much also to everybody who joined us. Thank you for being part of this conversation. It's been fantastic. Our next seminar in the Knowledge Cafe series will be in January in the new year. So hopefully, if you're really interested in this format, if you want to hear more of our discussions at the School of Cities, please keep an eye out for that. It will be a discussion with Felix Chung, and we're going to be talking about effects that reallocating government funds to military spending have on individual well-being. So a little bit of a topic shift from today, but I'm really excited for that. And I think it's going to be fantastic. So I hope that we'll see you all there. That's going to be on Wednesday, January 18th at noon. And for more details and to register, you can visit our website. The link is in the chat. Thank you again so much, everybody, for coming. Thank you so much, Aditi, for being here. And yeah, have a great rest of your Wednesday, everybody.
Thank you so much for having me.